The rain hammered against the rusted metal canopy of the old gas station, each drop echoing through the empty lot like a countdown to something inevitable. Sarah Mitchell stood behind the cracked register, her hands trembling as she counted the day's earnings for the third time, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. $42.17. Barely enough to keep the lights on for another week, let alone feed her 2 kids waiting at home. The neon sign outside flickered, casting shadows across her weathered face, a face that had aged 10 years in the past, too, since the divorce. This abandoned corner of rural Montana had become her entire world, a world that was about to be invaded by strangers with intentions she couldn't possibly imagine. If you enjoy stories of resilience, courage, and unexpected turns, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more incredible true stories every week. The gas station sat on the outskirts of Millerville, Montana, population 347, a number that seemed to shrink every year as young people fled to cities with actual opportunities. Sarah had inherited the place from her father 5 years ago, back when her marriage was still intact, back when Tom still pretended to care about something other than the bottom of a whiskey bottle. The building itself was a relic from the 1960s, all peeling paint and cracked concrete with 2 ancient pumps that barely functioned, and a convenience store that sold more expired goods than fresh ones. But it was hers, the only thing Tom couldn't take in the divorce, the only thing standing between her family and complete destitution. Her daughter Emma, 14, had started asking questions Sarah couldn't answer. Why can't we go to the movies anymore? Why do we eat pasta 5 nights a week? Why does Mom cry in the shower when she thinks no one can hear? Her son Jake, only 9, had stopped asking for things altogether, his silence somehow worse than Emma's interrogations. He'd taken to drawing pictures of their old house, the one they'd lost, the one with the swing set in the backyard and the room he didn't have to share with his sister. Sarah kept those drawings hidden in a shoebox under her bed. Couldn't bear to look at them, couldn't bear to throw them away. The afternoon shift dragged on with its usual parade of nothing. Old Pete Morrison stopped by for his daily coffee and lottery tickets, spending his Social Security check on dreams that would never materialize. The Hendersons drove through for gas, their Range Rover looking absurdly out of place next to Sarah's battered pickup. They were weekenders, rich folks from Billings with a cabin up by the lake, the kind of people who'd never understand what it meant to choose between electricity and groceries. Sarah smiled and made small talk, played the part of the friendly small-town gas station owner, all while calculating in her head whether she could skip her own meals to make sure the kids ate properly. The storm rolled in around 4, transforming the late autumn afternoon into premature darkness. Montana weather was like that, unpredictable and merciless, especially as winter approached. Sarah had just started closing up early, something she'd been doing more often lately, since customers were scarce anyway when the first vehicle pulled in. A black SUV with tinted windows, mud-splattered and aggressive-looking, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong in Millerville. She felt her stomach tighten with instinct, that primal warning system women develop when something isn't right. 2 men emerged from the SUV, both wearing dark jackets despite the cold, both moving with a purposeful stride that set Sarah's nerves on edge. The taller one had a scar running down his left cheek, and the shorter one kept his hand inside his jacket pocket in a way that suggested he was holding something he didn't want anyone to see. They didn't head for the pumps. They headed straight for the door of the convenience store. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the phone beside the register, but she stopped herself. Sheriff Daniels was 20 minutes away on a good day, and this storm would make it longer. Besides, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe they were just travelers caught in bad weather, looking for shelter and directions. Maybe her paranoia was a product of too many sleepless nights and too much stress. The door chimed as they entered, bringing with them the smell of rain and something else, something chemical and wrong. The taller man, the one with the scar, smiled at her, but it was the kind of smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. His eyes were cold, calculating, scanning the store with professional efficiency. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Sarah kept her voice steady, years of customer service training kicking in even as her heart raced. "Just looking around," the scarred man said, his voice smooth but with an edge that suggested he wasn't someone you wanted to cross. "Nice little place you got here. Quiet? Private?" The shorter man had moved to the back of the store, checking the storeroom door, looking out the rear window. Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't normal behavior. This wasn't travelers seeking shelter from a storm. "We're actually about to close," Sarah said, trying to inject authority into her voice. "Storm's getting bad, and I need to get home to my kids." The scarred man's smile widened. "Kids, huh? That's nice. Family's important. You live around here?" Every instinct in Sarah's body screamed danger. She'd grown up in Montana, had learned young how to read threats in the wild, and these men were predators, pure and simple. But she was alone, isolated, with no help coming and no clear escape route. The rational part of her brain told her to play along, to be cooperative, to not antagonize them until she understood what they wanted. "Just down the road," she lied. "My husband will be here any minute to pick me up." The scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "That's so? Because we've been watching this place for a few days now, and we haven't seen any husband. Just you, all alone, struggling to keep this dump running." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They'd been watching her, planning something. This wasn't random, wasn't opportunistic. This was calculated, deliberate. But why? What could they possibly want with a failing gas station in the middle of nowhere? Before Sarah could respond, headlights cut through the storm, another vehicle pulling into the lot. The scarred man's expression changed, irritation flashing across his features. His hand moved inside his jacket, and Sarah caught a glimpse of metal, a gun. Her blood turned to ice. The new arrival was a beat-up sedan, ancient and rust-covered, steam rising from its hood. The driver's side door opened, and a figure emerged, hunched against the rain. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that posture, that way of moving. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. The figure entered the store, water dripping from a worn military jacket, face obscured by a hood. But when they looked up, Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. It was Marcus. Marcus Reeves. Her older brother, the one who'd disappeared 12 years ago, the one who'd joined the army and then vanished into the kind of life families don't ask questions about. The one who'd been declared dead 3 years ago, after a mission gone wrong, somewhere in a country whose name was redacted from all the official documents. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice rougher than she remembered. Aged by experiences she could only imagine. "We need to talk." The scarred man's hand tightened on his weapon, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus ignored him, his attention fixed on Sarah. "I know this is a shock, but I need you to trust me. These men aren't here for the gas station. They're here because of what's hidden underneath it." Sarah's mind reeled. What was he talking about? There was nothing under the gas station except dirt and old pipes, but the look on Marcus's face, the tension in the scarred man's posture, told her this was real, that somehow her failing business had become ground zero for something dangerous, something she didn't understand. The shorter man had moved closer, his hand now openly holding a pistol. "I don't know who you are, pal, but you just walked into the wrong situation. Turn around and walk out, and maybe you live through the night." Marcus finally looked at the two men, and Sarah saw something in her brother's eyes that made her realize he wasn't the same person who'd left Millerville all those years ago. This was someone who'd seen things, done things, survived things that would break most people. This was someone dangerous. "You're from the Petrov operation," Marcus said. "Not a question, but a statement. You've been tracking the cash for what, 6 months? 8? And you finally traced it here to the last place anyone would think to look." The scarred man's smile disappeared entirely. His gun came out, leveled at Marcus. "Last chance. Walk away." "Can't do that," Marcus replied, his voice calm despite the weapon pointed at his chest. "My sister owns this place. These are her kids' futures you're threatening. And more importantly, that cache isn't going anywhere with you." Sarah's head spun, trying to process what she was hearing. A cache? What cache? Her father had owned this gas station for 40 years, had run it honestly, had died of a heart attack working the register. What could possibly be hidden here? The tension in the room was suffocating. 4 people caught in a moment that could explode into violence at any second. Sarah's hand inched toward the phone again, but Marcus caught her eye and shook his head slightly. No cops. Whatever this was, it was beyond local law enforcement. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain hammering the roof. "What's going on?" Before Marcus could answer, the scarred man made his move. His finger tightened on the trigger, but Marcus was already in motion, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hand striking the gunman's wrist, sending the weapon spinning across the floor. The shorter man raised his pistol, but Marcus grabbed a can from a nearby shelf and hurled it with precise force, catching the man square in the face. Blood spurted from his nose as he stumbled backward, his shot going wild, shattering a window. "Get down!" Marcus shouted at Sarah, who dropped behind the register, her hands over her head, her mind struggling to comprehend that her quiet gas station had transformed into a war zone. The scarred man recovered quickly, launching himself at Marcus, and suddenly they were locked in brutal close combat, trading blows that echoed through the small store. The shorter man wiped blood from his face, searching for his dropped pistol, his eyes wild with rage and pain. Sarah's survival instinct kicked in. She couldn't hide. She had to do something. Her hand found the baseball bat she kept behind the register, the one her father had always said was for snakes, but they both knew was for worse predators. The shorter man found his gun, raising it toward Marcus, who was still grappling with the scarred man. Sarah didn't think. She just moved, swinging the bat with all her strength, connecting with the back of the shorter man's head. The impact reverberated up her arms, and the man crumpled, the gun clattering away once more. Sarah stood there, shaking, unable to believe what she'd just done, the bat still raised, ready to swing again if needed. Marcus managed to get behind the scarred man, putting him in a chokehold that looked professional, efficient. Within seconds, the man's struggles weakened, and then he went limp. Marcus lowered him to the floor, breathing hard, checking his pulse. He's alive, just unconscious. Sarah lowered the bat, her entire body trembling. "Marcus, what the hell is happening?" Her brother stood, wiping blood from a cut above his eye. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry you got dragged into this. But we don't have much time. There are more of them coming. That SUV outside, it's been sending signals. They know something went wrong." "More of them?" Sarah felt hysteria bubbling up in her chest. "Marcus, I don't understand any of this. What cash? Why are these people here? And how are you alive? They told me you were dead." Marcus moved to the window, peering out into the storm. "I was dead, for all intents and purposes. Deep cover operation that went wrong. Had to disappear, become someone else. I've been tracking this group for 2 years, Sarah. They're trafficking weapons, drugs, information. Anything that makes money and destroys lives. And 12 years ago, when I was still working legitimate operations, we intercepted one of their shipments. Weapons-grade materials that couldn't be traced through normal channels. We had to hide it, somewhere no one would think to look." Sarah's mind slowly connected the pieces. "You hid it here, under Dad's gas station." "Not just me. Dad knew. He was the only one I could trust. We buried it deep under the old service bay, the one he sealed up years ago. He agreed to watch over it, to keep it safe until we could properly dispose of it. But then he died, and the information about the location got out somehow. These people, the Petrov organization, they've been systematically hunting down every cache we hid. This is one of the last ones." Sarah felt anger rising through her shock. "So all this time, while I've been struggling to keep this place running, while I've been choosing between feeding my kids and paying the mortgage, there's been something dangerous buried underneath, something that's brought killers to my door?" "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But Sarah, if they get what's under there, people will die. A lot of people. Those materials can be used to make weapons that terrorists and criminals would pay millions for. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let Dad sacrifice me nothing." The sound of vehicles approaching cut through their conversation. Marcus tensed, moving back to the window. 3 more SUVs. We're out of time. Sarah's mind raced. Her kids. Emma and Jake were at home, alone, waiting for her. If these people knew where she lived, if they went after her children, she grabbed her phone, dialing with shaking fingers. The weight of motherhood had never felt heavier than in this moment, every decision carrying consequences she couldn't fully calculate, every second ticking away like a bomb counting down to devastation. Emma answered on the second ring. "Mom? Where are you?" "The storm's getting really bad." The lights flickered twice already, and Jake's scared. He keeps asking when you're coming home. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah said, forcing calm into her voice despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I need you to take Jake and go to Mrs. Henderson's house right now. Don't ask questions. Don't pack anything. Just go. Tell her it's an emergency and I'll explain later. Can you do that for me, sweetheart?" "Mom, you're scaring me. What's happening? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I need you to be brave right now. Remember what Grandpa used to say? Family protects family. I'm protecting you by asking you to go. Please, Emma, please, just trust me." The silence on the other end stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Emma's voice came back, steadier now, older somehow. "Okay, I'll get Jake and we'll go. But Mom, you have to promise me you'll be okay. You have to promise you're coming back." "I promise, baby. I love you both so much, more than anything in this world." "I love you too, Mom. Jake says he loves you. We'll be at Mrs. Henderson's." She hung up before Emma could ask more questions, praying her daughter would listen, praying Mrs. Henderson wouldn't ask too many questions. The Hendersons lived 3 miles away, far enough that hopefully these people wouldn't connect them to Sarah. She thought about Emma gathering Jake, explaining in that careful way she'd developed since the divorce, taking on responsibilities no 14-year-old should have to bear. She thought about Jake, probably clutching his sketchbook, trusting his sister completely, because that's what 9-year-olds do when their world is falling apart. Marcus had been watching her during the call, his expression unreadable. "You're a good mother. Better than I was a brother. I should have been here. Should have helped you through the divorce, through all of it. You were doing what you had to do, just like I am now." The headlights were getting closer, 3 vehicles moving in formation, professional and coordinated. Marcus's jaw tightened as he assessed the threat. Petrov doesn't send this many people unless they're absolutely certain of what they're after. Someone gave them detailed information. Someone on the inside. Someone who knew about the cache locations. "Can we run?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Can we just get in your car and go?" They'd chase us, they'd find us, and then they'd use your kids as leverage to get what they want. No, we end this here, tonight. We destroy the cache, eliminate the threat, make sure they have nothing to come after you for. And what happens to us? To you? Marcus checked his weapon, his movements practiced and efficient. I told you, I'm already dead. Have been for years. But you've got a future. Those kids need their mother. So we do this my way, and when it's over, you walk away clean. The vehicles pulled into the lot, doors opening in synchronized precision. Sarah counted 8 men, maybe more, all armed, all moving with military discipline. These weren't street criminals or opportunistic thugs. These were professionals, trained killers sent to retrieve something valuable enough to justify this level of operation. Marcus, she whispered, her voice breaking, I'm scared. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw her brother again, the one who'd taught her to fish in the creek behind their house, the one who'd promised to always protect her no matter what. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Fear keeps you alive. Just remember, no matter what happens, you fought back. You didn't just accept your fate. Dad would be proud of that. The word steadied her, gave her something to hold on to in the chaos. She tightened her grip on the pistol Marcus had given her, feeling its weight, understanding that this piece of metal might be the only thing standing between her children having a mother and becoming orphans. The thought was sobering, terrifying, but also clarifying. She would do whatever it took to survive this, to make it back to Emma and Jake. The front door exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood and breaking glass. Tear gas canisters rolled across the floor, spewing their chemical fog, transforming the familiar space of her gas station into a war zone. Sarah's eyes immediately began watering, her throat constricting. But Marcus was already moving, pulling her toward the back of the store. They burst through the storeroom door just as more windows shattered, more canisters releasing their burning payload. Marcus shoved a heavy shelf in front of the door, buying them seconds at most. Sarah could hear the men entering, could hear their coordinated calls to each other, professional voices marking positions and clearing sectors. The storeroom was cramped and cluttered, filled with 3 decades of accumulated supplies and forgotten equipment. Sarah had always meant to clean it out, to organize it properly, but there had never been time, never been money, never been energy after keeping the business barely alive. Now she was grateful for the chaos, for the maze of boxes and shelves that might slow their pursuers even slightly. Marcus was already moving boxes, revealing the small door Sarah had noticed years ago but never investigated, assuming it was just a closet or crawl space. Her father had been more prepared than she'd realized, had built in escape routes and contingencies, planning for threats Sarah had been blissfully ignorant of her entire adult life. This connects to the old mechanical tunnel, Marcus explained, his voice low and urgent. Dad and I installed it when we buried the cache. It's tight, barely wide enough to crawl through, but it'll get us to the sealed service bay. Can you do this? Sarah nodded, though the thought of crawling through a narrow, dark tunnel while armed men searched for them made her want to vomit. She thought of Emma and Jake, safe at Mrs. Henderson's, waiting for her to come home. She thought of all the times she'd told them that family doesn't give up, that you fight for what matters. This was her chance to prove those weren't just empty words. They entered the tunnel, Sarah going first at Marcus's insistence. His body between her and the door, a human shield if the men broke through. The passage was even tighter than Marcus had described, the walls pressing in from all sides, dirt and cobwebs thick in the air. Sarah's claustrophobia kicked in immediately, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, panic clawing at the edges of her control. Breathe, Sarah. Marcus's voice came from behind her, steady and calm. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're doing great. Just keep moving forward. Think about Emma and Jake. Think about getting home to them. She focused on his voice, on the rhythm of breathing, on moving one hand forward and then the other, progressing inch by inch through the suffocating darkness. Behind them, she could hear the storeroom barrier being breached, could hear men shouting and searching. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, each second an eternity of enclosed space and mounting terror. Her hand suddenly met empty air, and she realized they'd reached the end. Marcus helped her climb out into the sealed service bay, a space Sarah had never seen inside during her 5 years of ownership. The bay was larger than she'd expected, surprisingly clean despite being sealed for over a decade. And in the center of the concrete floor was an obvious addition, a metal ring set into fresh concrete, clearly marking the location of whatever her father and Marcus had buried. This is it, Marcus said, kneeling beside the seal. This is what they're after. Weapons-grade plutonium, enough to build a dirty bomb that could contaminate an entire city. We intercepted it from a Russian trafficking operation 12 years ago. Should have been destroyed through proper channels, but there were concerns about leaks, about moles in the agency. Dad agreed to hide it here while we investigated. Then he died, and the investigation went cold, and I was pulled into deeper operations. Sarah stared at the concrete seal, trying to process the magnitude of what had been hidden beneath her failing business. People in Billings, in Helena, in cities she'd never even visited, they were alive right now because her father had said yes to hiding something dangerous because he'd taken on a burden that could have gotten him killed. And he'd never said a word, had carried that secret to his grave. "How do we destroy it?" she asked. Marcus pulled a small device from his jacket, something electronic with a digital display. Thermite charge. Burns hot enough to melt through anything, including nuclear materials. It'll render the plutonium completely unusable, just a melted radioactive puddle that's too contaminated to be worth extracting. But, Sarah, the fire it creates, it's going to be intense. This whole building is going to burn. Everything you have here, everything Dad built, it'll be gone. Sarah thought about the gas station, about her father's legacy, about the business she'd poured her heart into trying to save. She thought about the register, where she'd counted $42.17 just hours ago, about the coffee machine that never worked quite right, about the neon sign that flickered in the Montana storms. Then she thought about Emma and Jake, about their futures, about the life they deserved to live without looking over their shoulders. "Burn it," she said firmly. "Burn it all. Things can be replaced. People can't." Marcus nodded, a flash of pride crossing his face. "You sound like Dad. He always said the same thing. People first, everything else is just details." The sound of the tunnel entrance being discovered echoed through the passage, flashlights sweeping the darkness, voices calling out coordinates and positions. Time had run out. Marcus worked quickly, pulling up the concrete seal to reveal a reinforced container beneath, marked with radiation warnings and handling protocols. The reality of what they were dealing with hit Sarah viscerally. This wasn't just some abstract threat. This was real, tangible danger that could kill thousands if it fell into the wrong hands. Marcus attached the thermite charge to the container, his hands steady despite the urgency. "When this goes off, we'll have about 30 seconds before the heat becomes unbearable, maybe a minute before the structure starts collapsing. There's a service door on the north side of the bay. We go through that, we run for the tree line, and we don't stop until we're at the old Miller property. That's where I left my real vehicle, the one they don't know about. What if we don't make it? Then we don't. But at least they don't get what they came for. At least your kids stay safe." The tunnel entrance exploded inward, men pouring through, flashlights and weapons sweeping the space. Marcus pushed Sarah behind him, his hand on the detonator, his body language shifting into combat readiness. Sarah raised her weapon, remembering everything her father had taught her about shooting, about breathing, about staying calm under pressure. "Last chance," Marcus called out to the armed men. "Walk away. There's nothing here worth dying for." The scarred man emerged from the group, his face bruised and furious from their earlier fight. "You should have stayed dead, Reeves. Hand over the detonator, and maybe we let the woman live." "Maybe isn't good enough," Marcus replied, his voice cold and final. The scarred man's eyes flicked to his men, a silent signal Sarah recognized too late. They were going to rush them, overwhelm them with numbers, willing to sacrifice a few men to secure the prize. Marcus must have seen it too, because he was already moving, throwing himself forward as the first shots rang out. Sarah fired, her weapon kicking in her hands, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. She didn't know if she hit anyone, couldn't process the chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting and bodies moving in the confined area. Marcus was a blur of motion, taking down men with brutal efficiency, each movement precise and lethal, a lifetime of training evident in every strike. One of the attackers broke through Marcus's defense, rushing toward Sarah with a knife. She fired twice, center mass like her father had taught her, and the man went down. The reality of what she'd done hit her in the gut, but there was no time to process, no time to feel. Another attacker was already coming, and she was moving on pure instinct, pure survival drive. Marcus reached the scarred man, and they locked in brutal close combat, grappling for control of weapons and the detonator. Sarah tried to get a clear shot, but couldn't risk hitting her brother. More men were entering the bay now, at least 6 of them, too many to fight, too many to stop. She saw Marcus's eyes meet hers across the chaotic space, saw the decision forming before he made it. "No," she screamed, understanding what he was about to do, trying to reach him, trying to stop the inevitable. With a final burst of strength, Marcus threw the scarred man backward, directly onto the open container of plutonium. His hand slapped the detonator. The thermite ignited with a brilliant white light, intense heat washing over the space like a physical blow. "Run!" Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the chemical reaction. "Run now, Sarah." She didn't want to leave him. Every instinct screamed at her to stay, to drag him out, to not abandon her brother again. But he was already pushing her toward the service door, already making sure she had a path to escape. And she understood with terrible clarity that his sacrifice only meant something if she survived to live the life he was buying for her. Marcus was methodically checking the weapons he'd taken from the two unconscious men. "We can't let them get inside. Can you shoot?" Sarah nodded. Her father had taught her, had made sure she knew how to handle a gun growing up in rural Montana. She hadn't touched one since the divorce, but muscle memory was a strange thing. Marcus handed her one of the pistols. "Safety's off. Point and shoot if you have to. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. If this goes bad, if they get past me, you run. There's a trail behind the station that leads to the old logging road. You take that and you don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You have kids who need their mother. I'm already a ghost. I've got nothing to lose." Before Sarah could argue, the front window exploded inward, glass showering across the floor. A canister rolled through the broken window, spewing thick smoke. Tear gas. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back of the store. They burst through the storeroom door just as more windows shattered, more canisters releasing their chemical fog. The storeroom was cramped, filled with decades of accumulated junk, boxes of supplies, old equipment her father had never thrown away. Marcus shoved a shelf in front of the door, a temporary barrier at best. "We need to get to the service bay. The one over the cache. If we can secure it, destroy the access, they'll have nothing to come after." Sarah's eyes were watering from the tear gas seeping under the door, her throat burning. "How do we get there without going back through the front?" Marcus was already moving boxes, revealing a small door Sarah had never paid attention to, something she'd always assumed was just a closet. Her father had been more prepared than she'd realized. "This connects to the old mechanical tunnel. It's tight, but it'll get us there." They crawled through the narrow passage, Sarah's claustrophobia battling with her adrenaline, the sound of men shouting and searching echoing behind them. The tunnel was barely wide enough for Marcus's shoulders, dirt and cobwebs thick in the darkness, the air stale and suffocating. Sarah focused on her breathing, on moving forward, on surviving for Emma and Jake. They emerged into the sealed service bay, a space Sarah had never actually seen inside. Her father had locked it years before his death, had told her it was structurally unsound, too expensive to repair, but now, in the dim light from Marcus's flashlight, she could see it was perfectly sound, just deliberately abandoned. And in the center of the floor was a concrete seal with a metal ring, clearly added long after the bay was built. Marcus knelt beside it, his hands working quickly to uncover the mechanism. "Sarah, I need you to understand. What I'm about to do, they can't know I did it. My identity is compromised just by being here, but if they realize I'm still active, still working against them, they'll go after everyone I've ever known, including you and the kids. So what are you going to do?" "Destroy it. All of it. The cache, the evidence, everything. And then I disappear again. For real this time." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, though whether from emotion or the residual tear gas she couldn't say. "I just got you back." "You never really had me back, sis. The person you knew died a long time ago. I'm just his ghost, trying to clean up the mess we made." The sound of the storeroom barrier being breached echoed through the tunnel. Time had run out. Marcus worked faster, pulling up the concrete seal to reveal a metal container beneath, marked with warnings and codes Sarah didn't understand. He pulled out a small device from his jacket, something electronic and sophisticated. "This is a thermite charge," he explained, attaching it to the container. "When it goes off, it'll melt everything inside, make it unusable. But Sarah, it's going to cause a fire. A big one. You need to be outside before I trigger it." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you, I promise." Sarah knew it was a lie, could see it in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders. This was a sacrifice play, a last stand. "No," she said firmly. "We both go, or neither of us goes." Marcus smiled, and for a moment she saw her real brother, the one who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd defended her from bullies at school, who'd promised to always protect her. "You were always stubborn." The tunnel entrance exploded inward, men pouring through, flashlights and weapons sweeping the space. Marcus pushed Sarah behind him, his hand on the detonator. "Last chance," he called out to the armed men. "Walk away. There's nothing here worth dying for." The scarred man emerged from the group, his face bruised and furious. "You should have stayed dead, Reeves. Hand over the detonator, and maybe we let the woman live." "Maybe isn't good enough," Marcus replied. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion and at lightning speed simultaneously. The scarred man raised his weapon. Marcus threw himself forward, using his body as a shield for Sarah. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space, bullets ricocheting off metal and concrete. Sarah screamed, bringing up her own weapon, firing blindly, desperately. One of the attackers went down, then another. Sarah didn't know if she'd hit them or if Marcus had, didn't care, could only focus on survival. Marcus was hit. She could see blood spreading across his shoulder, but he kept moving, kept fighting, his military training evident in every efficient movement. He reached the scarred man, grappling for control of his weapon. They crashed into equipment, locked in a brutal struggle. Sarah tried to get a clear shot, but couldn't risk hitting Marcus. More men were entering the bay now, at least 6 of them too many to fight. Marcus must have realized it too. He met Sarah's eyes across the chaotic space, and in that moment she understood what he was about to do. "No!" she screamed, but he'd already made his decision. With a final burst of strength, Marcus threw the scarred man backward, directly onto the open container. His hand slapped the detonator. "Run!" he shouted at Sarah. "Run now!" The thermite ignited with a brilliant white light, intense heat washing over the space. Sarah didn't think, just moved, diving back into the tunnel as men screamed behind her as the cached materials began their chemical reaction, as her brother kept his final promise to protect her. She crawled through the darkness, smoke and heat chasing her, her hands torn and bleeding, her lungs burning. Behind her, the bay was an inferno, temperatures high enough to melt steel, to destroy evidence, to end threats. Tears streamed down her face as she emerged back into the storeroom, as she stumbled through the smoke-filled convenience store, as she burst out into the cold Montana rain. Sheriff Daniels was pulling into the lot, drawn by the smoke and flames, his face shocked at the scene before him. Sarah collapsed on the wet concrete, coughing, barely able to breathe. The gas station, her father's legacy, her last possession, was burning, flames reaching toward the stormy sky. "Marcus, my brother Marcus, he was inside." The sheriff tried to go in, but the heat was too intense, the structure already collapsing. Sarah watched her past burn, watched the last connection to her brother disappear into smoke and ash. The other attackers who'd been inside, they were gone too, caught in the destruction Marcus had unleashed. In the chaos that followed, fire trucks from 3 counties, investigators, questions she could barely answer, Sarah clung to one truth. Emma and Jake were safe. Mrs. Henderson had gotten them, had kept them away from this nightmare. Whatever else had been lost, they were alive. The official story, pieced together by investigators over the following weeks, was simpler than the truth. A criminal organization had targeted the gas station, believing valuables were hidden there from previous owners. They'd attacked, caused an explosion, died in the resulting fire. Sarah Mitchell had barely escaped with her life. Her heroism in fighting off attackers before fleeing was noted but not dwelled upon. The investigation was complicated by the fact that most evidence had been destroyed in the intense heat. What they found in the ruins confused them. Melted metal, chemical residues that suggested military-grade materials, but nothing conclusive. The case was eventually classified as a criminal matter with no clear resolution, a footnote in Montana law enforcement records. But 3 weeks after the fire, as Sarah was sorting through the remains of her life, trying to figure out what came next, a lawyer appeared at her temporary apartment. He represented a company Sarah had never heard of, offered her a settlement for the gas station property. A generous settlement, enough to pay off all her debts and start over somewhere else. The paperwork was complex, but legitimate. The lawyer explained that environmental cleanup was expensive, that the company wanted to avoid liability, that this was their best offer. Sarah sat across from the lawyer in the cramped apartment she'd rented with borrowed money, Emma and Jake in the bedroom trying to pretend they weren't listening to every word. The settlement was substantial, more money than Sarah had seen in years, possibly more than her father had ever made from the gas station in total. It was enough to completely change their circumstances, to give her children opportunities she'd thought were lost forever. But she wasn't naive. This money came with strings attached, invisible ones that would tie her to silence, to compliance, to accepting the official story and never asking uncomfortable questions. The lawyer's eyes held that same knowing look she'd seen before, a recognition that suggested this wasn't just about environmental cleanup and liability. "There's one condition," the lawyer said, sliding an additional document across the table. "A non-disclosure agreement. You agree not to discuss the specifics of what occurred at the property with anyone outside of law enforcement. Standard procedure in cases involving potential hazardous materials." Sarah read the document carefully, looking for the traps, the clauses that might come back to haunt her. But it seemed straightforward, protecting the company from lawsuits and protecting her from having to relive the trauma publicly. She thought about Marcus's last words, about disappearing, about keeping her kids safe. This money was the tool that would make that possible. She signed. She wasn't stupid enough to refuse money when she desperately needed it, when it represented the difference between survival and continued struggle. But she noticed something in the lawyer's posture as she finished signing, a subtle relaxation that suggested relief. They'd been worried she might refuse, might ask questions, might become a problem that required more complicated solutions. The lawyer stood, shaking her hand with professional efficiency. "The funds will be transferred within 72 hours. I'd recommend consulting with a financial advisor about proper management of this windfall. And Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you and your children find peace and safety wherever you choose to rebuild your lives." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet apartment, the signed documents in front of her, the weight of choices settling on her shoulders. Emma emerged from the bedroom, her teenage face trying to look mature and understanding. but unable to hide the hope in her eyes. "Is it enough?" she asked quietly. "The money? Is it enough for us to be okay?" Sarah pulled her daughter into a hug, feeling Emma's thin frame, the way she'd lost weight during the stress of the past months, the way she'd grown up too fast dealing with divorce and poverty and now violence. "Yeah, baby, it's enough. We're going to be okay. We're going to be more than okay." Jake appeared in the doorway, his sketchbook clutched to his chest like a shield. "Does this mean we don't have to move again? Can we stay somewhere long enough for me to make friends?" The question broke Sarah's heart. They'd moved 3 times in the 2 years since the divorce, each time to cheaper housing, each time forcing Jake to leave behind the fragile connections he'd started to build. He'd stopped trying, stopped hoping for stability, and now here he was, 9 years old and already expecting disappointment. "We're going to find a place," Sarah promised. "A real place. And we're going to stay there. You're going to have your own room, and Emma's going to have hers, and we're going to plant roots so deep nothing can pull us up again." 2 days later, the money arrived exactly as promised. Sarah stared at the bank balance on her phone screen, the numbers seeming unreal after so many years of checking accounts that hovered near zero. She felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, guilt, gratitude, and a lingering sadness for what that money represented. Marcus's sacrifice, her father's years of burden, the burning of everything she'd known. She booked 3 tickets to Portland under her maiden name, Mitchell, something she'd kept even during her marriage to Tom. It was common enough to not draw attention, but different enough from her married name to create a layer of separation from her past. She researched neighborhoods, looking for places with good schools, low crime rates, and enough anonymity that a single mother with 2 kids could blend into the background. The flight to Portland was Jake's first time on a plane. He pressed his face to the window during takeoff, watching Montana shrink below them, the endless landscape of his childhood becoming abstract patterns of brown and green. Sarah watched him watching, wondering what he was thinking, whether he understood they were leaving behind more than just a state. Emma sat beside her, earbuds in but music off, Sarah noticed. Her daughter was pretending to be occupied while actually listening to everything, a teenager's illusion of privacy while staying hypervigilant. The trauma of that night had changed Emma in ways Sarah was still discovering. She startled at loud noises. She checked locks obsessively. She'd started sleeping with a baseball bat beside her bed, something Sarah pretended not to notice. "They're going to ask questions," Emma said quietly, pulling out one earbud. "At the new school, about where we came from, why we moved. What do I tell them?" "The truth, mostly," Sarah replied. "Your parents got divorced. Your mom inherited a business that didn't work out. We decided to start fresh somewhere new. That's all true. You just leave out the parts about the fire and the men with guns." "And Uncle Marcus?" Sarah felt the familiar twist in her chest at the mention of her brother. "He's dead, Emma. That's what you say if anyone asks. He died years ago. Because in every way that matters, that's true." The apartment Sarah found was in a quiet neighborhood in northeast Portland, the kind of place where people minded their own business but nodded hello in passing. It was twice the size of anywhere they'd lived since the divorce, with actual bedrooms for each kid, a kitchen that didn't share space with the living room, and windows that looked out on trees instead of parking lots. Jake claimed the smaller bedroom immediately, saying it was cozier. But Sarah suspected he just wanted to be closer to her room, wanted the security of proximity after everything that had happened. Emma took the larger bedroom with studied indifference, but Sarah saw how carefully she arranged her things, how she spent an hour positioning her desk and bed, creating a space that felt defendable, controllable. The first few months in Portland were an exercise in learning how to be normal again, or perhaps learning how to be normal for the first time. Sarah got her job as a bookkeeper through a temp agency, starting with short-term assignments before landing permanent employment at a local grocery chain. The work was steady and predictable, requiring attention to detail, but no emotional investment, exactly what she needed. Emma started at Madison High School in January, mid-year, which was the worst possible time to transfer, but she approached it with the same determination she brought to everything, joining the debate team and throwing herself into academics. Her grades were perfect, almost obsessively so, as if controlling her GPA was a way of controlling the chaos she couldn't articulate. Jake's transition was harder. He was quiet at his new elementary school, spending recesses drawing instead of playing, eating lunch alone with his sketchbook for company. Sarah's heart broke watching him struggle, but his teacher, Mrs. Palmer, understood somehow. She started an art club during lunch, giving Jake a space to connect with other kids through drawing instead of words. Slowly, painfully slowly, he began to emerge from his shell. The nights were the hardest. Sarah would lie awake listening to the rain on Portland windows, so different from Montana storms, and think about Marcus. She'd replay that final moment, wondering if there had been another choice, another way, knowing that there probably wasn't, but torturing herself with the what-ifs anyway. She'd think about her father, about the burden he'd carried for years, about the price of keeping dangerous secrets in a world that didn't know how close it had come to disaster. Sometimes Emma would appear in her doorway in the middle of the night, not saying anything, just needing to verify that Sarah was still there, still breathing, still alive. They never talked about it, just acknowledged each other in the darkness before Emma returned to her room. Sarah understood. She was doing the same thing, checking on her kids multiple times each night, making sure they were safe, making sure the nightmares hadn't somehow become real again. Jake's drawings evolved during this time, becoming darker and more complex. He drew burning buildings and faceless figures, shadowy men and women running through rain. Sarah found these drawings, hidden under his bed, and wanted to throw them away, wanted to protect him from his own trauma, but Mrs. Palmer advised against it when Sarah sought her counsel. "He's processing," the teacher explained during a parent conference. "This is his language for what he experienced, even if he doesn't fully understand it. Taking that away would be like cutting out his voice. Let him draw. Eventually the darkness will fade, and he'll start drawing light again." Mrs. Palmer was right. Over months, Jake's drawings began to shift. The burning buildings started to include people escaping. The faceless figures gained features, expressions, humanity. He drew a series showing a family at a dinner table, simple and peaceful, that Sarah found so moving she had to excuse herself to cry in the bathroom. Emma's transformation was different, but equally profound. She channeled everything into achievement, into building a future so secure that no one could take it away. She researched colleges obsessively, focusing on schools with strong financial aid programs. She volunteered at a legal aid clinic, helping low-income families navigate bureaucracy, perhaps working through her own experiences of powerlessness by empowering others. One evening, about 8 months after they'd arrived in Portland, Emma came home with a permission slip for a field trip to visit Portland State University's criminal justice program. Sarah's hands shook as she signed it, seeing the trajectory forming, understanding that her daughter was being drawn toward a world that had nearly destroyed their family. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said carefully. "You don't have to choose this path just because of what happened." Emma met her eyes with a directness that reminded Sarah painfully of Marcus. "I'm not choosing it because of what happened. I'm choosing it because I understand now that there are people who fight to keep others safe, even when it costs them everything. Uncle Marcus did that. Grandpa did that. I want to be someone who does that too." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to protect her daughter from the dangers of that choice, but she recognized the futility. Emma had inherited the family stubbornness, the commitment to principle that had defined both her grandfather and uncle. All Sarah could do was support her and pray that Emma's path would be safer than theirs had been. The first anniversary of the fire came and went with surprising quietness. Sarah took the day off work, and the three of them drove to the coast, to Cannon Beach, where they walked along the shore and watched waves crash against Haystack Rock. They didn't talk about Montana or Marcus or the gas station. They just existed together, a family that had survived, connected by shared experience they couldn't discuss with anyone else in the world. Jake collected shells and drew them later with meticulous detail, labeled each one with a date and location. Emma took photographs on her phone, candid shots of Sarah and Jake, building a visual record of their new life. Sarah watched her children and felt something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. Not the naive hope of her youth, but the hard-won hope of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged on the other side. The second year in Portland brought more stability. Emma was thriving academically, had made a small circle of friends who thought she was fascinatingly serious and mature. Jake had a best friend named Michael who shared his love of art and didn't mind his quiet intensity. Sarah had a promotion at work, more responsibility and better pay, and had started taking online courses in business management, thinking maybe someday she'd be ready to try entrepreneurship again, something smaller and safer than a gas station. It was during this second year that the first cashier's check arrived. Sarah found it in the mail, an envelope with no return address, containing a check for $5,000 made out to her maiden name. No note, no explanation, just money that appeared like magic or mercy. She stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling, understanding flooding through her. Marcus was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived that inferno and was watching over them still, sending help when he could, maintaining his promise to protect family even from whatever shadow existence he'd disappeared into. Sarah never deposited that first check. She framed it instead, hung it in her bedroom where only she would see it, a reminder that her brother was out there somewhere, that his sacrifice hadn't been the end but a transformation. The subsequent checks, arriving twice a year without fail, those she deposited, using the money to build college funds for Emma and Jake, to create the future Marcus had died, or pretended to die, to secure. 2 days later, Emma brought in the mail. Among the bills and junk was a postcard showing the California coast, no return address. On the back, in handwriting she hadn't seen in 12 years, were 4 words: "You're safe now. Disappear." Sarah held the postcard, tears streaming down her face. Marcus had survived. Somehow, impossibly, he'd gotten out of that inferno and disappeared again. The message was clear. The Petrov organization would be looking for answers, for revenge. Sarah and her kids needed to become people who didn't exist, needed to fade into the background of American life. She burned the postcard that night, watching the California coastline curl and blacken in the kitchen sink, destroying the evidence of communication while memorizing every detail. The handwriting was Marcus's, but shakier, suggesting injury or age or exhaustion. The postmark was from Sacramento, though she doubted that's where he actually was. Her brother would know better than to give away his real location, even in a brief message meant to comfort and warn. Emma found her standing over the sink, watching the ashes swirl down the drain. "Was that from Uncle Marcus?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. "He wanted us to know he's okay, that we're safe." "But we're not really, are we?" Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who'd grown up too fast and understood too much. "We're just safer than we were. There's a difference." The observation was painfully accurate. They'd traded one kind of danger for another kind of watchfulness, one kind of poverty for a more comfortable but still uncertain existence. They were alive, together, and building something new, but the shadow of what had happened would always be there, coloring their choices, informing their decisions, keeping them vigilant in ways most families never had to consider. The years that followed were marked by a strange duality, surface normality underlaid with constant awareness. Sarah taught her children how to be observant without being paranoid, how to notice details without obsessing, how to prepare for danger while still living full lives. They developed codes and protocols, family language for potential threats that sounded innocuous to outsiders. Emma graduated high school as valedictorian, her speech about resilience and second chances so moving that Sarah cried through the entire thing. She'd been accepted to several prestigious universities, but chose Portland State, wanting to stay close to home, to maintain the family unit that had survived so much. Sarah argued that she should take the scholarship to Georgetown, but Emma was adamant. "We stay together," she said firmly. "That's what family does. That's what Uncle Marcus died to protect. I'm not splitting us up now just for a prestigious name on a degree." So Emma studied criminal justice at Portland State, living at home and commuting to campus, maintaining her perfect GPA while interning with various law enforcement agencies. Sarah watched her daughter's determination with a mix of pride and fear, seeing how Emma was drawn to the same world that had consumed Marcus, hoping desperately that her path would be different, safer. Jake bloomed in high school, his art becoming recognized beyond just family appreciation. He won competitions, got pieces displayed in local galleries, started selling commissions to pay for college. His style evolved from the dark trauma processing of his early Portland years into something more nuanced, capturing human emotion with startling accuracy. He had a gift for seeing people clearly, for translating their inner lives onto canvas or paper. During Jake's junior year, he created a piece that stopped Sarah in her tracks when she saw it displayed at a school art show. It was a portrait of a man in shadow, face partially obscured, but the eyes were rendered in perfect detail, haunted and determined and infinitely sad. Jake had titled it The Guardian, and Sarah understood immediately that he was drawing Marcus from memory, from the brief glimpse he'd had that terrible night, from stories Sarah had finally started sharing as the kids got older and could handle the complexity of their family history. "You remember him?" Sarah said softly, standing beside Jake as they looked at the portrait together. "Not really," Jake admitted. "I remember feelings more than images. I remember feeling like someone was protecting us, like we were safe even though everything was chaos. I tried to capture that in his eyes. Someone who's seen terrible things but keeps watch anyway." The piece sold for $800 to a collector who specialized in military and veteran art. Jake split the money 3 ways, giving Sarah and Emma each a third, saying that the art came from their shared experience, from the family they'd built from ashes. Sarah tried to refuse, but Jake was insistent, and she recognized in his stubborn generosity the echoes of Marcus, of her father, of a family legacy built on protecting and providing for each other. Emma graduated college with honors and immediate job offers from several federal agencies. She chose the FBI, specifically requesting assignment to their financial crimes division, explaining to Sarah that she wanted to fight terrorism and organized crime by following the money, cutting off resources rather than engaging in the kind of direct confrontation that had defined Marcus's career. "It's safer," Emma assured her mother during a late-night conversation after accepting the position. "I'll be an analyst, mostly working from offices, tracking financial networks and money laundering operations. I won't be in the field, won't be taking the kinds of risks Uncle Marcus took." Sarah wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that Emma's path would be different, but she'd learned that danger came in many forms, that threats weren't always physical, that the people who followed money into dark places sometimes discovered things that made them targets. All she could do was trust Emma's training, her judgment, and the instincts she'd inherited from a family of survivors. The FBI required extensive background checks, interviews with family members, deep dives into history and associations. Sarah navigated these with careful truth, explaining about her father's gas station, the fire that destroyed it, her decision to relocate to Portland for a fresh start. She mentioned Marcus as her deceased brother, a veteran who died overseas, showing the official documentation that confirmed his death years before the gas station fire. The investigators found nothing to disqualify Emma, nothing to suggest the complicated truth beneath the surface of their careful narrative. Jake chose the Rhode Island School of Design for college, his first time living away from home, his first real independence. Sarah helped him pack, filling boxes with art supplies and clothes and all the accumulated materials of his high school years. The night before he left, they sat together in the living room, just the two of them, Emma working late at her new FBI position. "Thank you for keeping us safe," Jake said quietly. "I know I don't say it enough, but I understand what you did for us, what you gave up. The gas station was your inheritance, your connection to Grandpa. You let it burn to protect us." "It was just a building," Sarah replied, though they both knew it was more than that. "You and Emma are what matter. Everything else is negotiable." "I want you to know that I'm okay," Jake continued. "The drawings, the dark stuff I used to make, that was me processing things I couldn't understand, but I'm past that now. I'm not broken by what happened. I'm shaped by it, but not broken. You did that. You kept us whole when we could have shattered." Sarah hugged her son, this young man who'd been 9 years old and clutching a sketchbook when their world exploded, who'd grown into someone thoughtful and talented and whole despite everything. She thought about the drawings he used to hide under his bed, the nightmares he'd pretended not to have, the way he'd gradually healed through art and time and the stubborn love of a family that refused to quit on each other. The house felt empty after Jake left for Rhode Island, just Sarah and Emma in a space that had once held three. They adjusted, developing new rhythms, adult daughter and mother navigating a relationship that was equal parts familial and friendship. Emma would come home with stories from work, careful not to share classified information, but giving Sarah glimpses into the world of financial forensics, the complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts that funded everything from drug cartels to terrorist organizations. It was during Emma's second year with the FBI that everything nearly came apart. She was assigned to a task force investigating international weapons trafficking, and one of the organizations they were targeting had connections to the Petrov network. Emma discovered this while running down a lead, finding references in seized documents to operations in Montana, to a failed retrieval of weapons-grade materials, to outstanding debts of honor that demanded repayment. She came home that night, pale and shaking, and Sarah knew immediately that their past had caught up with them. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten countless pasta dinners during the lean years, and Emma laid out what she'd found. "They're still active," she said, her voice controlled but tight with tension. "Petrov's organization. They're smaller now, less influential, but they're still operating, and they have files on the Montana incident. They know there was someone besides the men they lost. They know someone got out, someone who might have information about their operations." "Do they know about us? About you?" "Not yet. But if I keep investigating, if I follow these leads where they naturally go, I'm going to draw attention. Someone's going to notice an FBI analyst who seems overly interested in an old Montana incident. Someone's going to make connections." Sarah felt the familiar cold dread settling in her stomach, the feeling she'd thought was behind them, relegated to nightmares and anniversary reactions. She thought about Marcus's postcard, his warning to disappear, his understanding that some threats never fully went away, they just waited for opportunities to resurface. "Then you drop it," Sarah said firmly. "You find a reason to recuse yourself, or you request transfer to a different case, or you do whatever you need to do to step away from this investigation." "But Mom..." "No buts. Emma, listen to me. Your uncle sacrificed everything, including his identity, his life as he knew it, to keep us safe. Your grandfather carried a burden for years that he never complained about, that he never shared, because he was protecting something important. I burned down my inheritance and started over in a new city with a new name to protect you and Jake. We do not throw all of that away because you want to be thorough with a case. We do not risk your life, our lives, for professional advancement or even for justice. Sometimes survival is its own victory. Do you understand?" The silence stretched between them, Emma processing, Sarah holding firm despite the part of her that understood her daughter's struggle, the desire to finish what had been started, to bring justice to an organization that had caused so much pain. But Sarah had learned hard lessons about the cost of justice, about the price of fighting evil, and she wasn't willing to pay with her daughter's life. Emma finally nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll request transfer. Financial crimes has plenty of other investigations. I'll cite potential conflict of interest, personal history in Montana that might compromise objectivity. It won't hurt my career. It might even look like strong ethics to flag it myself. Thank you, Sarah whispered, pulling her daughter into a hug, feeling Emma's shoulders shake with silent sobs, understanding that this was grief for the justice they couldn't pursue, rage at the limitations imposed by safety, and relief that she didn't have to make this choice alone. Emma's transfer was approved within the week, assigned to a major investigation into cryptocurrency-based money laundering that had no connection to Petrov or weapons trafficking or anything related to their past. She threw herself into the new work with characteristic intensity, and gradually the pallor faded from her face. The tension eased from her shoulders. Sarah breathed easier, grateful that crisis had been averted, that her daughter had chosen life over vindication. It was shortly after this that Daniel appeared in their lives. Sarah had never considered that Marcus might have had a child, might have built any kind of life outside his shadow operations. The young man who showed up at her door looked so much like Marcus had at that age that Sarah gasped, momentarily transported back decades to when her brother was young and whole and hadn't yet disappeared into the darkness of classified missions. "I'm Daniel Reeves," the young man said, his voice uncertain but kind. "I think you're my aunt. My father, Marcus, he asked me to check on you if anything ever happened to him. He's gone now. Cancer. He died 3 weeks ago in a hospital in Denver, using a different name, but he made sure I knew how to find you before he went." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process the layered grief of this information. Marcus had been alive all these years, had been surviving somewhere, had built enough of a life to raise a son, and then the universe had taken him anyway, not through violence, but through the cruelty of disease. She invited Daniel inside, made tea with shaking hands, called Emma home from work with a cryptic message that meant family emergency. She booked 3 tickets to Portland under her maiden name, found a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one asked questions, got a job as a bookkeeper for a local grocery chain, work that was steady and anonymous. Emma adapted to her new school with teenage resilience. Jake slowly started smiling again, started drawing pictures of their new life instead of their old one. At night, Sarah would sometimes stand at the window, watching the rain and remembering a gas station in Montana, a brother who died twice to keep her safe, and the price of secrets kept by good people trying to stop bad things. She'd think about her father, about the burden he'd carried for years, about the choice he'd made to help Marcus, to protect something dangerous so it couldn't harm innocents. 6 months after the fire, Sarah was walking home from work when she noticed a man across the street watching her building. Panic surged through her, but then the man turned, and in the evening light, she saw not a threat, but a familiar scar on his cheek. It wasn't the scarred man from that night. It was Marcus, the scar now healed, or perhaps it had been someone else all along. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of checking on family, of making sure his sacrifice had meant something. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the Portland crowd, a ghost among the living, a brother who'd given everything to protect what mattered. Sarah never saw him again. But every year on the anniversary of that terrible night, a cashier's check would arrive, enough to help with the kids' expenses, to make life a little easier. No note, no explanation, just the continued protection of a guardian who couldn't be acknowledged, couldn't be thanked, couldn't be anything except a memory and a promise kept. Emma graduated high school with honors, got accepted to college with scholarships Sarah could never have afforded alone. Jake grew into a thoughtful young man, his drawings evolving from houses and gas stations to portraits of people, capturing emotions and stories in pencil and paper. Sarah built a quiet life, boring and beautiful in its normalcy, grateful for every mundane moment. The gas station property in Millerville remained empty for years, eventually purchased by the county and turned into a small park. A memorial plaque was placed there, naming Sarah's father as a veteran and community member, making no mention of what had really happened, of what had been hidden and protected and ultimately destroyed. Sometimes, when Sarah drove past gas stations in Portland, she'd remember the smell of motor oil and coffee, the sound of ancient pumps, the feeling of being trapped in a failing business with no way out. But she'd also remember the moment her brother came back from the dead, the moment she'd swung a baseball bat to protect him, the moment she'd understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The Petrov organization never found her. Whether that was because they'd been crippled by the losses that night, or because Marcus continued to protect her from the shadows, or simply because 3 people in Portland were beneath their notice, Sarah never knew. She chose not to look too deeply into that question, chose instead to focus on the life she'd built from ashes. Emma called one evening during her sophomore year of college, excited about an internship she'd gotten with a federal agency, something involving security and intelligence. Sarah's heart clenched, seeing her daughter drawn to a world that had taken her uncle, but she said nothing. Everyone had to make their own choices, had to find their own path. Jake sold his first portrait for $200, a piece that captured something raw and honest about resilience. He gave half the money to Sarah, told her it was for all those years of pasta dinners and sacrifices. She cried, told him to keep it for his future, but he insisted. "Family takes care of family," he said, words that echoed something Sarah's father used to say, something Marcus had lived by. The rain in Portland reminded Sarah of that Montana storm, but it was gentler here, less violent, more persistent than dramatic. She'd grown to like it, the way it washed the streets clean, the way it made everything green and alive. On particularly stormy nights, she'd make coffee and sit by the window, remembering a gas station that no longer existed, a brother who'd died twice to save her, and the strange mercy of chaos that had transformed her life. Years passed. The sharp edges of memory softened but never disappeared entirely. Sarah never remarried, never dated seriously, telling herself she was focused on the kids, but knowing deeper down that she couldn't risk exposing anyone else to the danger that might still lurk in her past. She built walls around herself, protective barriers that kept the world at a safe distance. But those walls cracked the day a young man appeared at her door, maybe 25 years old with familiar eyes and a nervous smile. He introduced himself as Daniel, said he'd been asked to check on her by someone who couldn't do it himself. He handed her a sealed envelope, told her to read it when she was alone, and left before she could ask the questions flooding her mind. The letter inside was brief, written in Marcus's handwriting. "Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be gone for real. The cancer they promised wasn't real, turned out to be very real after all. Funny how that works. I wanted you to know that every sacrifice was worth it. You built a good life, you raised good kids, you survived, and that's all I ever wanted. Daniel is your nephew. I couldn't be a father in any traditional sense, but I tried to prepare him to look out for family. He doesn't know the full story, and I'd like to keep it that way. Just let him be in your life if you can. He's a good kid. You would have liked his mother. I'm sorry I never got to bring her home to meet you. Be happy, Sarah. That's all any of us ever wanted. Your brother, Marcus." Sarah sat for a long time, holding the letter, processing the information. Marcus had a son. She had a nephew. And Marcus was dying, or perhaps already dead, somewhere far away, alone except for the son he'd trained to carry on his protective legacy. The unfairness of it all crashed over her. The waste of his life, the years they'd lost, the family gatherings that never happened. But underneath the grief was something else. Gratitude. Marcus had lived his life according to principles she could respect, had made choices that protected innocent people, had never stopped being her brother even when the rest of the world thought him dead. He'd given her years she wouldn't have had otherwise, safety she couldn't have bought or fought for on her own. Sarah called Daniel, invited him to dinner. Emma and Jake were skeptical at first, protective of their mother and suspicious of strangers bearing family connections. But over pasta, the meal that had sustained them through hard years, Daniel told stories about his father, careful stories that revealed character without exposing secrets. He talked about a man who valued loyalty and family, who taught him to stand up for what was right even when it cost everything, who died knowing he'd made a difference. They never spoke directly about that night in Montana, about gas stations and caches and men with guns, but understanding passed between them. Unspoken acknowledgement of truths too dangerous to vocalize. Daniel became part of their lives, the cousin Emma, and Jake had never known they needed, the connection to Marcus that made his absence feel less complete. The years continued their march. Sarah's hair turned gray. Emma graduated college and joined the FBI, working to protect people the way her uncle had, though she never knew the full truth of his sacrifice. Jake opened a small gallery, showcasing artists who told honest stories about survival and resilience. Daniel became a regular presence at family dinners, eventually bringing a girlfriend who asked no questions about his complicated family history. On the 10th anniversary of the gas station fire, Sarah drove back to Millerville alone. The park was peaceful, well maintained by the county, a place where children played without knowing about the violence that had occurred there. She stood where the convenience store had been, where she'd counted $42.17, and where her life had ended and begun in the same terrible night. A figure appeared beside her, older now but still familiar. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, having followed her, despite her insistence that she needed to make this trip alone. He handed her a small box, worn leather, clearly old. "He wanted you to have this," Daniel said softly. "I was supposed to give it to you when the time was right. I think today is that day." Inside the box were Marcus's dog tags, his military medals, and a photograph Sarah had never seen. It showed Marcus, younger and healthier, standing beside a beautiful woman holding a baby. On the back, in faded ink, were names and a date. Daniel's mother had died when he was 3, cancer taking her suddenly, leaving Marcus to raise a son alone while maintaining his cover, his missions, his dangerous double life.